Hello, it's me again. I'm actually recording this for the Tuesday, Thursday group, but it may turn out to be somewhat helpful for the Monday, Wednesday crew if you want to review a little bit about creating a good quality lesson plan. The first step is to always align with your state standards. We've been working on this for the last couple of days, but I just want to remind you that your objectives are at the top and they're identified if you were talking to your instructor, as you would say, in Bio 2C or in Bio 2A. And that would tell them a little bit about what you're going to cover in class that day. If you look over here on the right, the essential knowledge and skills are written in a way to indicate what level of blooms you need your kids to know this information at. And of course, like we did last week, you would look at the verbs that you see here. So explain, recognize, explain, identify, describe, explain, so on and so forth. When you look at that Bloom's chart, you'll notice that these words are found at the lower end of Bloom's because remember, the Virginia SOL standards are written at a lower, kind of the minimum level that they want you to teach this information at, and then they want you to take it higher and more rigorous depending on the group of students that you're working with. So if we're going to use Bio 2, an example of writing an objective for Bio 2A in this case, which if you look over here, Bio 2A talks about the structure and function of water chemistry and its impact on life. I would write it as Bio 2A, students will investigate and understand water chemistry and its impact on life processes by completing a water properties lab. So there is my standard for that particular lesson plan. Then you're going to add in your lesson plan an essential question you want students to be able to answer at the end of the lesson. And this, by the way, is found on the lesson plan sheet that you are going to receive from either me or the sub. And you can kind of just follow down the lesson plan sheet and it'll explain what each of these are. I've given you 2 copies of the lesson plan sheet because one of them you can write some notes on and the other one you can begin creating your lesson. So if my objective is Bio 2, and it should say A here, Bio 2A, students will investigate and understand water chemistry and its impact on life processes by completing a water properties lab. The essential question I want my students to be able to answer at the end of this lab is, how do the properties of water impact life processes? This is an important question because this is what you're going to use to create your assessment at the end of the activity. And it could be that, and we'll talk more about assessments here in a couple of slides, but it could be that you simply go around student to student and ask this very same question. Or you give them an exit slip with this question on it and they answer it. And that gives you an idea of whether they got it or they didn't that day. Or it can be as complicated as a quiz or a test. It depends on what your desired outcome is for your assessment. Okay, but your assessment is at some point going to answer this question because it's the whole point of the lab. All right, then you're going to plan the lesson. And the lesson is basically, it comes in the basic 6 steps that I'm going to label A through F. The lesson includes an anticipatory set, which is a beginning or a hook, the meat of the lesson, which is the direct instruction, guided practice, some sort of review, a closure, and then a chance for students to have independent practice. Sometimes C, D, E, and F are a little bit different. Like you may move F up between C and D because you want them to have some independent practice before you review. And sometimes, like often in math or something like that, you do the lesson, you do the practice, you review the practice, you kind of close that out, and then you say, okay, I'm going to give you a worksheet and I want you to work through these practice questions. Okay? So the anticipatory set, or the beginning and hook, can be in the form of lots of different things, but the whole goal is to really bring students into the lesson that you're about to teach. So it's usually something intriguing, or it's something that's going to bring in some prior information. So you're setting the stage up here for students to learn the new information. This can be a movie clip, an audio clip, a quote, a question for review from the day before, a cartoon that creates thought and conversation. It can be lots of different things, but you really want them to be engaged here. A lot of people think this is just a way to kind of bring kids into the fold of the classroom and the community of the classroom, which is true. But there is a strong connection between learning and not learning if you can engage some prior knowledge or some prior thought before they learn something new. So this anticipatory set or hook sometimes makes that connection before they start with the new stuff. Then you're going to move on to the meat of the lesson. This may be a PowerPoint, a video, a lecture, a ed puzzle video where they're answering questions, a demonstration, explanation, a lab with thoughtful questions. And a lab's a little bit different sometimes because the kids are doing a lot of the work in the middle of the lesson to learn something. And if that's the case, which is perfectly fine, you want kids to be doing the bulk of the work, you definitely want your review to mean something. So you'll want to be well prepared for the review so kids are getting the information that they need from the lesson. Regardless of the good plan for your direct instruction, you're going to make sure that kind of this is kind of the process that you would go through. Okay, so state the main points of the lecture, introduce a main organizing theme, use examples, use repetition, summarize. All of these things are kind of, this is a good plan for the meat of your instruction. In the guided practice part of your lesson, you would guide students through whatever type of work they're going to do independently. You may work together through math problems. You may demonstrate good lab practices. You may work through English sentences or an example of a writing prompt. Just make sure that this is directly related to the practice students will do independently. I don't know how many times I've heard students say, I couldn't do math last night because Mrs. So-and-so, the work we did in class didn't match the work I was doing outside of class. And that's confusing for kids, even if it's a tiny bit different. So you really want to start with almost exactly the same kind of work. And then as they do their homework, it just gets a little bit more complicated as you go along. You really want it to flow like that. Then you're going to review the content you covered. Sometimes that review can be something a little complicated, like a Kahoot game. Or maybe it's just a 3-2-1 exit ticket where they tell you 3 things they learned, 2 things they didn't, so on and so forth. You could have some whiteboard review questions, or just to throw up one of those old SOL questions and see how well they do with that. But you do want some sort of review to make sure that they were listening. Okay, sometimes this is graded, sometimes it's not. It's up to you how you want to do that. And then your closure. This should conclude the direct teacher interaction with students. It can look like any of the following as well: an exit slip, a quick section of a worksheet, a quick video, a new cartoon. Any of these things work. It sometimes looks like the anticipatory set, it's just a little bit different. Could be, talk to your partner kind of thing and throw out some questions. Something so that students are wrapping up the direct instruction from you, making some connections, asking maybe even some questions before they do work on their own. Your independent practice then should start nearly exactly like your guided practice. So maybe it's pretty easy. It's at a Bloom's lower level up here. And then eventually it gets into something a little bit more complicated down here. I like to do this kind of practice in class. Some teachers wait for this to be homework, but I find that if I give this out in class and then I'm just silent, maybe I walk around and just kind of check over my shoulder, how people are doing, that will allow them to work independently, but then still have me to ask questions, like they can ask me questions with this, okay? The next part of your lesson should be just a list of the materials that you need. And there's more materials than you think. You can write 24 copies of this, or, pens, colored pencils. This is often used by science teachers if they're grabbing a lesson plan from some other teacher. Of course, this is super helpful for them. The fifth part of a lesson plan goes back to our differentiation that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. You're going to put in just a section of how you would meet the varying learning needs of your classes. If you take a look at the example I have right here, this particular teacher actually mentions the student by initial and what they did specifically for that kid. You don't have to do it that way, but just make sure you have a plan to differentiate, not just for kids who are struggling to learn, but also those kids who are well ahead of others. They shouldn't always just get the instruction that they need to take out a book and read, or do you have any work left in another class or something like that. If you have a chance to encourage them at a higher level of learning, you really should try to do that. The assessment is important as well, sometimes just as important as the lesson. I always think about the assessment before I even start the lesson. So how am I going to assess this information? Because I've been doing this a little while, I have some assessments that I use every single year. So I go through that assessment to make sure that my direct instruction meets all of those questions. This is always a good idea, especially if your county has a specific test that they're going to give to students. You want to make sure those students come well prepared. The assessment, though, doesn't have to be a quiz and a test. It can be lots of different ways that students show you that they learned it. So here's a nice little list, but if you even Googled unique ways to assess work in class, you'll get tons of ideas. All right, so let's say use the handout sent via email to begin formulating your lesson. I'm going to give you the hard copy so you can make copies, like make notes based on this video. I've given you an extra copy so that you can write it out if you want, but I'm also going to send it through email so you can type it if you want. Okay? So if you have any questions, of course, please email me. I'm happy to answer anything that you need, but hopefully this is helpful enough to let you get started on your lesson planning. So I think that's it. All right, you guys, I will see you next week.